In Russia, over the last 500 years or so, there has been in place what is often described as a patrimonial state, a state that is one in which the rulers make no distinction between their own property and the property of the wider public. Instead, they see it as their task to determine what happens to everything and use it for their own benefit. For a brief moment in 1917, for several months after the overthrow of the Tsarist regime in March 1917, there was a period of genuine political debate in Russia, the rise of several liberal parties, particularly the Cadets, and there were hopes of establishing a system in which there would be the rule of law and very firm limits on the discretionary powers of the state and certain rights of the individual. With the rise of the Bolsheviks in November 1917, the seizure of power in Petrograd, subsequent civil war, and the consolidation of a tyrannical regime in Russia, none of that came to pass. And instead, Russia went through one of its most dictatorial times, and that basically meant that for almost 75 years, Russians were again under the rule of an extremely repressive, illiberal regime. In the perestroika years under Gorbachev, there were certainly great strides made toward guaranteeing certain limits on the discretionary power of the state. The Communist Party was curbed and eventually disbanded at the very end. There were much greater freedom of expression, freedom of the press. It wasn't perfect by any means, but by the standards of Soviet rule, it was extraordinary how quickly and how successfully things changed. But then, because of problems that arose with some of those reforms, the Soviet Union came to an end. That was followed with the rise of a government that had been democratically elected and that seemed to want to establish firm, genuine liberalism in Russia. And it did achieve many things. It certainly widened the scope of freedom of expression, gave great freedom of the press. There was critical coverage of that government's actions, including during the war in Chechnya in the mid-1990s, that helped bring an end to that war. So there were important gains made, but the problem was that it was accompanied by economic hardship. There was not so much the fault of the government, although there were major mistakes made, but it was simply the consequence of the turmoil that surrounded the collapse of the Soviet economy and the need to shift to a new economic system. So most Russians nowadays look back on that period thinking of it primarily unfairly, but it's the way they look on it is to think of it as a time of hardship and instability. And so with the rise of a highly illiberal regime, again under Vladimir Putin at the very end of the 1990s, and has been in power as the top leader in Russia ever since now for almost 18 years, that he has returned Russia to a much more authoritarian system. What that means is that there no longer is any real hope at this point of establishing limits on the discretionary power of the state. Instead, you have what has been, I think, quite accurately described as a kleptocracy in place, a system in which the rulers have usurped the assets of society for their own benefit, have spirited away some of that money overseas, have constructed large homes and villas for themselves within Russia, and in addition have essentially done away with freedom of the press and have also done away with freedom of assembly and other basic rights that seem to be gaining traction in the 1990s. So the problem now for Russia looking ahead over the next few years, or at least after 2024, because Putin is still likely to be in power at least through 2024, is thinking ahead. It will be how to undo the consequences of the Putin years and to try to return to the reforms that had been underway in the 1990s to establish limits on the discretionary power of the state, to guarantee free and fair elections, which haven't existed in Russia for the last 20 years, and to ensure a basic level of civil rights, civil liberties, so that people can genuinely express what they think about the current situation in Russia, to allow power to change hands peacefully, something it still has not done in Russia to this day.